Hi, welcome to the Building Better podcast, where we explore the combination of building better businesses and better insights for investors. I'm with one of our stars, Meg Starr to be exact. She's the global head of impact here at Carlyle. Meg, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonathan.
There's no one else we would want to start this podcast series off with. So Meg, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Every firm on the planet is thinking about how they should engage with their communities, with their employees, and support the health of their constituents, as well as the environment. Are firms getting a wake-up call to make environmental, social, and governance efforts, or ESG, more than a compliance or marketing effort?
What's interesting, Jonathan, is that ESG has been rising on the corporate agenda for years, but we really saw that take off in the last year and a half. At the beginning of this pandemic, though, I had a few people ask me if this was bad news for ESG. Were these issues suddenly a lot less important in the wake of all the other issues that businesses are confronting and having to manage? What I found, though, is that it's really kind of the opposite. COVID-19 has accelerated a focus on ESG issues even more than previously imagined, and are bringing them to the top of the corporate agenda in some really interesting ways. I have three observations about how we've really seen the focus on ESG change in the past few months. First, it's not that climate change has moved to the back seat, it's that social issues have just climbed into the front seat. Companies are focused on employee health and safety, their supply chains, understanding their physical operations, in a way that have really made the S issues of ESG much more salient. Second, ESG competencies are just hallmarks of management excellence. Management teams that are agile, that are forward-thinking, that are focused on continuous improvements across all aspects of their business, those have really been the teams that have been able to weather this storm effectively. And so this focus on ESG as a business improvement tool is critical for investment performance, but particularly in times of dislocation, like we've seen with COVID-19, and like we see in instances of climate-related extreme weather events. And so the third thing is that ESG is really becoming a lens for finding untapped alpha in a rapidly changing world. I'll give you one quick example. In 2019, Carlyle invested in HireVue, a tech company which provides virtual interviewing and assessment technologies to help companies find the most qualified and diverse candidates more quickly. It's a great company. It makes hiring cheaper, faster, and more effective. And during a time of remote work, it's become increasingly critical. But interestingly, some of the ways that HireVue does its work is by using its technology to reach a wider array of candidates, not just the ones from top colleges. It structures the interview process, and it helps reduce unconscious bias in hiring decisions. And so as we've also experienced this national reckoning around race and inclusion, companies are increasingly focused on how to build more diverse teams, but they don't always have the tools or resources to do that. HireVue is a great example of a technology that's cheaper, it's faster, it's more effective, and it results in a much more diverse outcome. So in this instance, the social impact is actually a core part of the value proposition for this company. And it's a great example of how ESG can be a lens for finding value in a changing world, like we've seen in the past few months. So those are just three quick observations about how I've really seen the focus on ESG shift throughout this period of the global pandemic.
Appreciate those examples, Meg. I think the bottom line of what you're saying is that someone, let's say someone joins a firm, a communications team in the middle of the pandemic. They're probably somebody who's pretty good, right?
Completely. I think what we've seen is that there's just a real focus on how do we evolve businesses to meet the needs of a changing world. And that has to do with technology, that has to do with the environment, that has to do with people. And so it's just a broader aperture of thinking about the challenges facing us that go beyond just the balance sheet and the income statement.
Meg, we appreciate the very tangible example from HireVue of how ESG connects to very clear and tangible outcomes. In some ways, the way I would summarize what you seem to be saying is that ESG is about ROI more than anything else. Can you help us as investors connect the dots between ESG and business outcomes?
Sure. Fundamentally, our impact is rooted in building better businesses because better businesses are just worth more. What's changed is that the world is increasingly realizing, and the market is increasingly pricing in, the value of a much wider array of dimensions of business excellence. I'll give a couple of examples. Companies that have climate resilience have cheaper insurance costs. They have less risk of being damaged by extreme weather related events or rising sea levels. And now they're commanding significantly higher premiums in public markets as the markets price in the energy transition even faster than it's happening. Second, companies that have clear sustainability credentials are much more likely to attract and retain top talent, which many of our businesses cite as their competitive edge. 75% of millennials have said they would take a pay cut to work at a socially responsible company. It's now imperative not just for PR for companies to be able to demonstrate their approach to sustainability, it's critical for how they think about talent, attraction, and retention. And then third, companies that have more engaged, happy, and healthy employees have greater productivity and greater growth. So one example, one of our portfolio companies is called Veritas Technology. It's headquartered in Santa Clara, California. It's a tech company that develops and delivers backup and recovery, business continuity information, storage management solutions worldwide. Working hand in hand with our global investment resources team, Veritas started doubling down on their approach to healthcare for their employees. Veritas moved from a traditional carrier arrangement to a healthcare navigator model that are designed to specifically tailor to the needs of their more than 7,000 employees. There are these centralized navigators who serve as guides for individuals to navigate the healthcare systems, make decisions, and ensure that they're on track for the best possible healthcare outcomes. Over the past couple of years of using that model, Veritas has seen higher than average annual physicals, which you would think would lead to higher healthcare costs. But actually, it's led to earlier disease detection and lower than average specialty drug spend. So this coordinated approach to healthcare not only improved the health of Veritas's employees, but it's also directly impacted the bottom line. They've saved about 25% on the per employee healthcare cost annually from 2016 to 2018, while significantly improving the health and well-being of their employees. I think that's a great example of where profitability and social impact move in tandem. This idea of a trade-off is really 10 years ago. We're now focused on where we find areas where profitability and impact converge, and that's where the really interesting work starts.
Well, that's where the interesting work starts, and this is where the tough question gets thrown at you. So I apologize in advance. Meg, you mentioned that firms are seeing greater growth, greater retention, and greater profitability. To understand that, you need quality ESG data. Can you walk us through the types of ESG data we should all pay attention to as investors?
Jonathan, ESG data is one of my favorite subjects, so you'll have to cut me off on this one.
Oh, so this wasn't the hardest question then?
This is the most fun question. There's something of a divide in the ESG world. Some camps argue that you need bespoke material ESG data that's tied to specific industries and business models for it to really be useful. Other investors say you need ESG data that's fungible and comparable across portfolios so you can understand what you own, really make good decisions. Our approach at Carlyle is pretty simple. We think you need both. We fundamentally use data to make better investing decisions and to convey important information to investors and stakeholders. If ESG data isn't oriented towards one of those goals, it can become a marketing or a compliance exercise, which plays into the worst stereotypes of what ESG is. The interesting question is, how do you use ESG data to draw better insights, mitigate risks, capture growth markets, drive financial value? As private markets have become more and more efficiently priced, I think of ESG as an underutilized lens for finding inefficiencies and ultimately alpha. So I'll go through the two types of data very quickly. So bespoke data. This isn't the only data that matters, but it's really important for driving financial value within individual companies. We use SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, as a materiality framework to design a core set of quantitative ESG metrics that we track for some of our largest investments. The data are important because they help us target interventions and reduce costs. Energy is a great example. It's one of the pieces of low-hanging fruit when we're looking at improving the efficiencies of businesses. It can also help on things like employee health and safety. We worked with one of our companies, Paradigm Precision, which manufactures complex machine-fabricated components for gas turbine engines, to integrate environmental health and safety activities throughout its plant and track those. Over the course of that process, they reduced lost time instances by 55% over 2 years, a huge impact on the health of their employees and the profitability of the business. So that data really helps us target interventions for specific companies. It also increasingly helps with customers. Customers are increasingly valuing sustainability traits. For example, we've helped one of our portfolio companies, Wyman, which makes cleaning supplies, get their products certified under different green certification schemes because it helps demonstrate to consumers the traits that they want to purchase. I'll give one example of how that has really driven value in a particular portfolio company. Genealogy is a portfolio company out of our Europe buyout fund. It's a Spanish-based company that has a special technology to finish denim in the garment industry. Their technology is really efficient and uses about 85% less water and less chemicals than their peers. It's great because that reduces costs for the business. It's a big selling point as they sell into their end customers, but it's actually helped them with financing in the past few months. So earlier this year, we ended up getting a funded term loan for Genealogia that is thought to be the first European sponsored transaction with the pricing on the funded debt directly linked to ESG criteria. So in sum, Genealogia used these ESG data points to tie that to their debt, which in turn reduces the cost of debt if they're able to hit certain ESG goals. So that bespoke data is really important for driving down costs, increasing revenues, and increasingly for securing financing. And then the last piece, the broad-based metrics are equally as important, but for different reasons. Portfolio-wide data helps us understand what we own, identify risks, how we think about strategic asset allocation, particularly for things like climate change. It also helps us set benchmarks and track our progress over time. What I want to talk about and what I'm really interested in is if we have very granular ESG data across a host of our global portfolio companies, we can tie that to the very granular financial data we have in those companies. Is to start doing some really interesting and unprecedented research on which ESG factors are correlated with real financial outperformance. So one quick example, working with Jason Thomas, our global head of research, we looked at our portfolio companies and the diversity of their boards of directors over the past 3 full years. And what we found was that our own portfolio companies that have at least 2 diverse board directors had about 12% faster annualized earnings growth as compared to our companies that didn't have diverse boards. So we can look at the empirical research, we can look at outside studies all we want, but the proof is really in the pudding of our portfolio, and that data is helping us drive better investment decisions. So I know I said I'd take too long on this, so I'll wrap up with saying that collecting ESG data just to say you're collecting data is frequently a waste of time and can contribute to some of the negative stereotypes about this field. But ESG data, when you approach it with rigor and an investment mindset, it can be used to drive real, meaningful financial value alongside of environmental and social impact.
Really appreciate that overview. And of course, we would want to spend all day with you. We know you're very busy. So we're going to round out this episode with a segment we call Building Better Through Focus. So we would love to talk to you every day, all day, about impact and ESG. You are one of the smartest people on the planet on this topic. But again, we know you're very busy and we can't always be talking like this, even though this is the best part of the job. With that in mind, what are the 2 to 3 topics, areas, trends that we as investors should be reading about, understanding as we head into the final part of 2020 and into next year?
I would say the bottom line is by looking for a more comprehensive set of ways to drive impact within businesses, from engaged workforces to climate resilient assets, we drive better investment results and more sustainable returns for our investors and our shareholders. And so I think there are really three main things that I would say are really important for investors to pay attention to as this field develops. First, we have to get away from these binary indicators of yes, no, we do ESG, yes, no, we're a signatory, yes, no, we have a policy. We need to understand how and where ESG contributes to a better understanding of pricing risk and a wider set of tools for driving value. I'm much more focused on data that is performance-based and quantitative, as opposed to binary and focused on policies and disclosures and procedures. We really need to get into the weeds of how this integrates with business models to drive value. Second, ESG and this emerging field of impact aren't about static state business models. It's not useful to say this is a good ESG company and that is a bad ESG company and that is the way the world is going to be. What we need to focus on to really drive value is change over time. And so I'm much more interested in thinking about how do we as private investors use our time, our capital, our control, our expertise to help take companies from point A to point B over a hold period. It isn't a static state. It's change over time, and that improvement is what really matters. And then third, the goalposts are always getting moved. ESG is a dynamic field, not a static one. New issues are emerging, old issues are becoming business as usual and are getting priced in. And so it's important to always be thinking about how do you look around the corner? How do you see what ESG issues are coming down the pike towards you? And how do you make sure that businesses and management teams are agile and well prepared to face what's coming at them? So in sum, ESG has seen tremendous growth over the past few years, but I'm really excited today about where we are because I see it becoming a critical and a central part of investment strategies in the years to come.
Well, Meg, thanks so much for joining us. I certainly feel over the last 20 minutes you've helped all of us connect the dots, as I said, between ESG and alpha and return on investment. So really appreciate it. And I'm also persuaded that this is an incredibly dynamic field. So I hope you'll come back to the Building Better podcast to keep us abreast of this dynamic field shortly.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.